I'm concluding our God and Government series tonight with a message on the poisoning of our public schools. The poisoning of our public schools. Jesus spent a great deal of time talking about education, teachers and students, but we miss it because he didn't use those exact terms. Jesus talked about discipleship. A disciple is a pupil, a student, a follower, a learner, and the word education is not found in the Bible. The word school is only mentioned once in the New Testament. So you have to really have spiritual eyes to see all Jesus said about the problem that can come from teaching, bad teaching, or the good things that can come from good teaching. And we've been talking about the principle that he set down in Luke chapter 6, verses 39 and 40, when he said, can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the ditch? And he's talking about teachers and students. He says in the next verse, the student who is fully trained will become like his teacher. The NLT says the student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. In other words, you become what you behold. And this works for the people in the pew as well as the kid in the classroom. There's a principle that's connected with teaching. Vodi Balcom says you cannot separate education and discipleship. Education is discipleship. Whoever educates our children is discipling our children. And if everyone ultimately becomes like his teacher, you can see the power of education. Now tonight I want to take another scripture from Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus is actually pronouncing a curse on the scribes and Pharisees, who were basically the public school teachers of his day. It says in verse 15, a curse is on you, scribes and Pharisees, false ones. For you go about land and sea to get one disciple, and having him, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. There again is the principle of the students becoming like the teacher. In this case, it's very negative. These are strong words that prove bad teachers reproduce themselves. And Jesus cursed them because they were poisoning God's people with false doctrine and turning their disciples into the sons of hell that they already were. So here's the thing tonight. If Jesus cursed the false teacher disciple makers of his day for leading God's people astray, wouldn't the same principle apply to our modern American public school systems, where indoctrination has replaced education and the government has replaced the parents? How did this happen? How did we get here? Because it hasn't always been this way. I believe another history lesson is in order. It may surprise many of you to know that government education of children is unbiblical and unconstitutional. Many years ago, H. Verlin Anderson said the institution of public education is so universally accepted today that many readers are apt to scoff at the idea that the control of education by the government and the use of public funds for its support is contrary to moral law. God assigns the responsibility in the Bible, in the Old and New Testament, for education to the parents. There's absolutely nothing in the Bible, Old, New Testament, where God commands the education of the children be given over to the government. I mean, where did Moses send his children to school? Well, let me make a second point. It's not only unbiblical, it's unconstitutional. Again, Vodi Balcom. Education is not mentioned in the Constitution. Did you know that? The 10th Amendment says the power is not delegated to the United States, in other words, the federal government, by the Constitution, nor prohibited by to the states, are reserved for the states, respectively, or to the people. This means that the federal government has no constitutional jurisdiction over education. The federal government has no constitutional jurisdiction over education. Michael S. Goldstein, in his from AmericanThinker.com, says, in his article, A Brief and Appalling History of the Department of Education, says, there has never been a constitutional basis for any federal control over education in the states. National government control of education is a constitutional travesty, a regulatory nightmare, a burden on the states and the people's budgets, and a burden on the state and local education systems and institutions over which it has made itself the overseer. America's founding fathers were very careful to avoid the snare and trap and dangers of federal government-run education. In his famous book, Democracy in America, the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville noted this fact. He said, as late as the 1830s, it was noted that education everywhere in the United States was in the hands of the Protestant clergy. Actually, for the first 50 years of our history as a country, Christians fought against compulsory government education. And even as late as 1900, 2/3 of America's high school age children were educated at home or in the church. But after the Civil War in 1868, something changed. President Andrew Johnson sought to establish a federal Department of Education, which was opposed by many, including New Jersey Congressman Andrew J. Rogers. He said this bill to establish a federal Department of Education asserts an unconstitutional federal jurisdiction over education, which the government can control through funding or a threat to remove funding. And this is exactly what's happened. The government, when we've all grown up with this, so we never questioned it, but the government has no right in the education of our children, and the fear was, and it's come true, that they can control the schools through funding, withholding funds or giving funds to schools that teach what they approve. This bill was opposed by Christian leaders as well, including one of my heroes, Princeton Seminary's A.A. Hodge. He wrote this just a few days before his death about this bill. He said, I'm as sure as I am about Christ's reign that a comprehensive and centralized system of national education, separate from religion, as is now proposed, will prove to be the most appalling enginery for the propagation of anti-Christian and atheistic unbelief and of antisocial nihilistic ethics, individual, social, and political, which this sin-torn world has ever seen. Of course, all this did come to pass. The department was established. But even over the years, many spoke up against it. Back in the 1950s, Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson said, I feel to warn you that one of the chief means of misleading our youth and destroying the family unit is our educational institutions. It ought to sting us to remember that all this poisoning of our public schools we'll talk about has been funded by you and me, the taxpayers. Think of this. In 1860, when the Department of Education was established, its budget was $15,000. By 2010, the budget for the U.S. Department of Education rose to $60 billion. But let's lay all that aside. Government education is not only unbiblical and unconstitutional. The primary problem is, and I'll spend a few minutes on this, the kind of pupils the public schools are producing. That is the real issue. This is the most important litmus test for any educational system, including government-run education. What's the fruit of it? Jesus taught us to judge the false teachers of his day by their fruit. Do you remember that? Matthew 7, 15, 16. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You will know them by their fruits. If the fruits of our public school systems is producing well-educated, moral, mature, outstanding citizens, well and good. But that's not what's happening. The fruit is bad. And I can tell you it's high time that American Christians wake up and realize that the goal of the government schools is not to educate, it is to indoctrinate the students into becoming wards of the state. I'll prove this to you tonight. This is not an accident. When I was researching this message, I discovered that there were many warnings over many years about how evil governments perpetuate themselves by systematically indoctrinating the children to become slaves to the state and the philosophies of the state. I was surprised that many of these voices were not Christian voices. I've always been haunted by what Jesus said: the children of this world are wiser in their generation than the children of light. I mean, it's sad to say that many times unbelievers see things clearer than the church sees them. One of the first feminists was Voltaire de Cleyre. She died in 1912. But what she said is true today. She said, if the believers in liberty, would that be you and me? Well, three of us. If the believers in liberty wish the principles of liberty to be taught, let them never entrust that instruction to any government. For the nature of government is to become a thing apart, an institution existing for its own sake, preying upon the people and teaching whatever will tend to keep it secure in its seat. The famous American journalist H.L. Mencken, certainly not a Christian, but a brilliant writer, who said a lot on this subject in the 50s. He said the most erroneous assumption that the aim of public education is to fill the young of the species with knowledge and awaken their intelligence is an erroneous assumption. Nothing could be further from the truth. The aim of public education is not to spread enlightenment at all. It is to reduce as many individuals as possible to the same safe level, to breed and train a standardized citizenry, to put down dissent and individuality. That is the aim of public education in the United States, whatever the pretension of the politicians, and that is its aim everywhere else. Mencken actually prophesied the propagandization of our schools. He said the plain fact is that public education is itself a form of propaganda, a deliberate scheme to outfit the pupil, not with the capacity to weigh ideas, but with a simple appetite for gulping down ideas ready-made. The aim is to make good citizens, which is to say docile and uninquisitive citizens. Actually, our government school systems today are the fruit of the seeds sown many years ago by evil men who saw students as future automatons. Now, what's an automaton? It's a moving mechanical device made in imitation of a human being. I don't know about you, friends, but I have talked about this for years. I've said it from the pulpit. I mean, this goes back into my 40s. trying to learn how to pastor and help people, and seeing the ongoing challenge with the teens, with the young people. I mean, have you ever wondered why so many of our young people today seem so sad, lacking joy, so mechanical, so bored? You very rarely see a young person with glowing vitality and enthusiasm. And honestly, I figure, well, maybe we better serve some more pizza at the youth group. But that didn't work because it's a deeper problem. It's the fruit of an educational system that produces imitation humans. And it's by design. Let me quote some of these false prophets who actually established public education in America. Like William Torrey Harris, died in 1909. He was the superintendent of schools in St. Louis, Missouri. Quote, 99 students out of 100 are automatons, careful to walk in prescribed paths, careful to follow the prescribed custom. This is not an accident, but the result of substantial education, which scientifically defined is the subsumption of the individual. It's a philosophy of instilling groupthink in the young people. So they don't think for themselves, they think whatever everybody else is saying. There's a conformity that's required to what's being taught, and what's being taught is dictated by the curriculum set up by the teacher associations and the federal government. Then there was Frederick Taylor Gates, an interesting guy. He was a business advisor to multi-billionaire John Rockefeller back at the turn of the last century. He was the head of the General Education Board. In his book, The Country School of Tomorrow, in 1903, he said, in our dream or vision, the people will yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or science. We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters, nor great artists, painters, or musicians. Nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, or statesmen, of whom we now have an abundant supply. He says, for the task we set before ourselves is a very simple and beautiful one. To train these young people as we find them for a perfectly ideal life just where they are. An idyllic life under the skies and within the horizon, however narrow. Another man who influenced America's public school system was Charles Sanders Peirce. He died in 1914. He's considered the father of what's called pragmatic philosophy. He set forth his vision for education in his book, The Fixation of Belief. He said it's possible to fix belief. In other words, to direct the faith of the students, not in the individual, but in the community. Let the will of the state act then, instead of the individual. Let the will of the state act, not the individual. Instead of the individual, let an institution be created which shall have for its object to keep correct doctrines before the attention of the people, to reiterate them perpetually, and to teach them to the young, having at the same time power to prevent contrary doctrines from being taught, advocated, or expressed. Let all possible causes of a change of mind be removed from men's apprehensions. Let them be kept ignorant, lest they should learn of some reason to think otherwise than they do. Let their passions be enlisted so they may regard private and unusual opinions with hatred and honor and horror. Did you realize that today in the public schools, if you stand up and speak up for Christ or quote the Bible, you are considered someone giving hate speech? Because it's so foreign to hear anything like that uttered in today's classroom, because you've got indoctrinated students who've never heard anything but the philosophy that's being put out by the statists. So if someone speaks up something that's Christ-centered or kingdom-centered or quoting the Bible, they are considered with hatred and horror. This is nothing but mind control. An education system that teaches children what to think instead of how to think. John Dewey is considered the father of modern American public education. He said, children who know how to think for themselves spoil the harmony of the collective society which is coming, where everyone is interdependent. That's prophetic. It's an evil prophecy, but it's come to pass. Today, if you think individually and not collectively, which is socialistic, communistic thinking, then you are disturbing the harmony of the collective. The purpose for poisoning our public schools is to produce a generation of passive puppets who are enslaved to the socialistic state and towing the party line. In his book, Understanding Power, Noam Chomsky said, given the external power structure of the society in which they function, the institutional role of the schools, for the most part, is just to train people for obedience and conformity, and to make them controllable and indoctrinated. This was the intention all along. Bruce Levine, in his book, Resisting Illegitimate Authority, says by the time a student graduates, they have been taught to be passive, to be directed by others, to take seriously the rewards and punishments of those in authority, to pretend to care about things they don't care about, and to believe that one is impotent to change one's dissatisfying situation. That's another way of saying indoctrinating them into a victim mentality. So if you have less money than the kid across the aisle from you, then you can see that, and you're taught that you're impotent to change the situation. It's not like our day when we were taught to go out and get a second job or work after school or whatever. Today, children are taught that they're victims. And the latest one being the racist doctrines of critical race theory, where little white children now are going home to their parents saying, I didn't know we were racist, Mom. I just learned that in school. Passive, afraid of authority, propagandized, victimized. These are the fruits we find today in our graduates, and it's all by design. On the positive side, John Taylor Gatto, he was a two-time winner of New York's Teacher of the Year Award. And he wrote an amazing book called Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. Gatto says, schools are intended to produce formulaic human beings whose behavior can be predicted and controlled. To a very great extent, schools succeed in doing this, but the products of this schooling are irrelevant. Well-schooled people from government education are irrelevant. They can sell film and razor blades, push paper and talk on telephones, or sit mindlessly before a flickering computer terminal, but as human beings, they're worthless, useless to others, and useless to themselves. This is not something to take lightly. And as I said last week, when I started talking about the schools, this affects you. You say, well, I don't have any children. Well, my children are grown and gone. They're all on their own now. Beloved, we still have millions of American children in public schools, and you know a child or a grandchild or a great-grandchild that has kids in the system, and many parents today don't even know what's going on. There is a little bit of waking up. Look, even the late George Carlin, a comedian, said this years ago: governments don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. That's against their interests. They want obedient workers, people who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, and just dumb enough to passively accept it. Because what you have to see, and you can go check me out on it, go check history, go check any nation that has gone socialistic, communistic, any nation that is where the government is moving toward totalitarianism, and one of the primary targets are the public schools. And they cannot afford to allow a generation to think for themselves. They are a danger. Mencken said the most dangerous man to any government is the man who's able to think things out for himself without regard to the prevailing superstitions and taboos. Almost inevitably, he comes to the conclusion that the government he lives under is dishonest, insane, and intolerable. How many of you today are beginning to believe the government we are living under is dishonest, insane, and intolerable? Well, you're the guys I'm talking to. This is the great political awakening we're beginning to see today in our country. Those who can still think for themselves are the ones who realize the true nature of our current government and public education system. And we have been warned. A few years ago, Ambassador Alan Keyes, a great conservative Christian, asked, where do you find the most persecuted Christians in the world? They're in the classrooms of our government schools, where the assault is not upon the body, but upon the soul. I'm telling you, the goal of these government schools is nothing less than the de-Christianization of an entire generation. One of my heroes, Thomas Sowell, said, much of what's taught in our schools and colleges today seeks to break down traditional values and replace them with more fancy and fashionable notions. And that is why, friends, little boys and girls come home wondering if they may be little girls and boys. And little white children come home convinced they're racist and questioning the Christian faith of their parents. Economist Lou Rockwell explains the hidden agenda behind public education today. He's an economist. He said, it isn't a coincidence that governments everywhere want to educate children. Government education is supposed to be evidenced by the state's goodness and its concern for our well-being. But the real explanation is less flattering. If the government's propaganda can take root as the children grow up, those kids will be no threat to the state apparatus. They will fasten the chains to their own ankles. I have a huge burden for this, beloved. And as I said, our kids are grown, gone, they've got their own family, we've got grandchildren, now we have a great-grandson. But the burden for these young people, it is in me, it's on me, and I believe it's the burden of the Lord. And I believe there's a showdown coming over this issue. And there are many different options available to us. Of course, one is to continue to fight for parental rights, get involved, run for the school board, attend the parent meetings. Those are things. Of course, prayer, that's number one thing we should be doing. But many believe today, in their books now coming out, that Christians, it's time for them to consider pulling their kids out of the system. And I'm telling you, I believe that we are at that point. The showdown is, and I'll tell you one we haven't really talked about or thought about, but if this fire could ever be lit, what I shared with you earlier, I would like to see some Christian conservative politicians in the halls of power who have enough guts to stand up and call out the entire United States Federal Board of Education and call for its demolition. We do not need a federal Board of Education or Department of Education. Now they've run it under Health and Human Services because I think they can see what may come if Christian people ever rise up. And if it goes to the Supreme Court will demolish it because there's no, as I said, there's nothing in the Constitution to authorize what they're doing. They're doing it all because we've been passive and we have not heeded the warning. Let me close because I've got a couple of other comments before we show you a video. R.L. Dabney was born in Virginia in 1820. He went on to become a Presbyterian pastor. He was the chaplain in the Confederate Army and the father of systematic Christian theology. In his book, Discussions, in 1892, he gave his thoughts on education. He said, "There can be no true education without moral culture, and no true moral culture without Christianity. The very power of the teacher in the classroom is either a moral force or a degrading force. And there's no other moral basis than the Bible. So my argument is perfect and clear. The teacher must be Christian. But the American Commonwealth has promised to have no religious character." That's the separation of church and state. "Thus, it cannot be our teacher." I don't know how to say it any better. And this is the growing awareness among Christian parents that the time has come to pull the kids out of the system. I did not know this, and I'm a fan of Al Mohler Jr., who has been the president of the largest evangelical group in America, the Southern Baptist Convention. In 2005, I discovered that Mohler was actually formulating a plan to move into the Southern Baptist churches with a plan for Southern Baptist people to get their kids out of the system. He said this, again, in 2005. He said, "I believe that now's the time for responsible Southern Baptists to develop an exit strategy from the public schools. This strategy would affirm the basic and ultimate responsibility of Christian parents to take charge of the education of their own children. This strategy would also affirm the responsibility of churches to equip parents, support families, and other alternatives. At the same time, this strategy must acknowledge that Southern Baptist churches, families, and parents do not yet see the same realities in every context. Sadly, this is almost certainly just a matter of time." See, he saw it coming and made a plan. Unfortunately, his term as the president ended before he could implement this. But what he was saying in 2005, it's a matter of time, that was 17 years ago. And think how much worse it's gotten in the last 17 years. So the poisoning of this propaganda is worse. It's even worse than the false teaching and curse by Jesus in his own day, and I believe it's time to fight back. Now let me close with a couple of scriptures, because I've quoted everybody from Beelzebub to everybody but Sister Elizabeth. Here's a couple of scriptures from the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 20 and 21. He said, "O Timothy, guard what was committed to your trust. Avoid the profane and idle babblings and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. By professing it, some have strayed concerning the faith." Next week, I'll share with you how alarming it is that we're losing as high as 70 to 82% of our young people that go to secular colleges. We lose them the first year. They walk away from the faith. And parents, godly parents, good men and women, don't know what's happened to their children. The sudden turn. I raised them right, took them to church, lived a godly life, paid my tithes, read my Bible. I wasn't perfect, but how did this happen? I told you tonight how it happened. They didn't avoid profane and idle babblings and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. Then Colossians 2:8, "Beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ." I'm leaving this series. I knew it was coming because the Lord told me it was coming, and He wanted me to do something very specific, probably for the rest of the year. We'd done some of this several years ago, but it's time to do it again, regarding the fact that why we're losing the kids, and it's why we're even seeing the church decline. And it has to do with the fact that only 6% of American Christians today have a biblical worldview. 6%. Now, some of you are going, what is a biblical worldview? Well, if you've been around me for a few years, you know what it is, but the truth is, it's time. If we intend to be serious about the cause of Christ in America and preserve the nation that our forefathers delivered to us, we better get serious. Because the kind of Christianity we've been practicing in this country is not sufficient to withstand the flood tide of evil that is trying to change the nation today. And that is what we intend to do. And I'll close with the video because we're going to do the baptismal celebration here in a few minutes. But this is, I think it's 6 minutes or so. It's long, but it'll give me a chance to change clothes. No, here's how God works with me. He'll give me a thought, and it's like an embryo. It just grows, it's a little seed. And then He gives me a trigger. Like He'll give me something. He'll send something across my path that will say, now's the time. And this is it, because I saw this video yesterday morning. And I think when you watch it, if you've been in the series, you will see not only where it relates to what we've been talking about, but it also is a preview for what we're going to be doing as a church family the rest of the year. This is from the Christian Broadcasting Network, and it says it all.
A recent survey from the Cultural Research Center found a staggering disparity between the number of parents who claim to be Christian and those who actually hold a biblical worldview. 67% claim to be Christian, but only 2% hold a biblical worldview. Well, joining us with more on this and what can be done about it is veteran Christian pollster George Barna. Mr. Barna is Director of Research and co-founder of the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. George, did those findings shock you, and why is this happening?
It didn't really shock me because we've been studying worldview in America for more than 30 years. And so we've seen the pattern. I think what's really alarming, though, is how low the numbers are getting in terms of incidence of parents with a biblical worldview. The reason it matters, of course, is because a person's worldview develops between 15 to 18 months of age and 13 years of age. So it's those early years in a person's life where, because a worldview is essentially your decision-making filter, every decision you make in life goes through that filter. So you need to have a worldview to get by in life. What we find is that parents who biblically are called to be the primary shapers of the worldview in their children's life are not really doing the job. And even worse than that, we know now from the research that 98 out of 100 parents of children who are under the age of 13 can't do the job of handing over a biblical worldview because they themselves don't have one. Can't give what you don't have. So it really does amount to a crisis.
Well, George, how did this happen? I mean, was it a gradual thing or a sudden thing? And why did it happen?
Well, it's been happening consistently for at least the last 40 years, which is as long as I've been studying it. But we've seen that the momentum behind people leaving a biblical worldview or not developing a biblical worldview has really ramped up in the last 10 to 12 years. There have been a lot of cultural changes that have encouraged people to take on other worldviews. There has been a shift in what influences the way that people in America think, where now we know that the arts and entertainment media and the news and information media are the greatest shapers of the way that people think. And so even when we talk about the development of a worldview, those are the two factors that have the greatest impact on that development process. And then, of course, at the same time, you've got churches that have really focused on things other than worldview development and other than raising up children to be godly individuals. So you put all that together, and that's why we find ourselves where we are.
Not to mention public schools, I'm sure. And I know you also found that this is having a devastating effect on preteen children especially. Explain that.
Well, it is. I mean, what happens is because you have to develop a worldview, no matter which one you possess, whether it's going to be Marxism, postmodernism, secular humanism, biblical worldview, any of the many worldviews that are at your disposal. Children are trying to figure out what worldview makes the most sense for me as an individual. And one of the things that they do is they turn to their parents for clues and cues about what's the best worldview. But what we discovered is that as they're listening to and observing their parents, they're seeing a contradiction between what parents say and what parents do. And the bottom line on that is that it's indicated to children, well, you know what, my parents claim to be Christian, they claim they're living a Christian life, but they don't do what they say the Bible teaches or the church teaches or Jesus is all about. And therefore, I come to conclude that Christianity isn't real. It's not reliable. It's full of conflicts. So I'm going to have to look elsewhere for a worldview. And that's why it's so easy for movies and television shows and music and video games, all the different media, to start bringing those alternative worldviews into the presence of children. And because those are more coherent and cohesive, children are more likely to buy into that and leave their parents behind.
So it's the, don't do what I do what I say. I mean, how often did we hear that as kids? So are pastors and church members then to blame for all of this? You went over some of it, but I mean, doesn't the blame really come on the parents, the pastors, the churches? The pandemic's over. Still a lot of empty pews in churches now.
Yeah, and frankly, all of this has nothing to do with the pandemic. This has been a pattern that's been in place for a while. And so when we recognize that biblically parents have the primary responsibility for developing the worldview of their children, and churches have the primary responsibility for developing and supporting parents in what they're doing as parents in trying to raise children with a biblical worldview, both of them have failed at that task.
So then what do we do about it, George?
Well, we have to have, I believe, both a long-term and a short-term plan. The short-term plan is we've got to get parents doing the best that they can as quickly as possible to raise up today's young children to have a biblical worldview. Parents don't have that worldview, but that means then that at the same time, churches are going to have to rush in and prioritize worldview development, trying to do some patching up of the worldview of today's parents, but also then prioritizing what they're doing with the children who wind up going to church. The longer term strategy is to recognize it's all about children. Many of the leaders around the world for decades and decades and decades have said, give me children until they're 7, till they're 8, till they're 9, and I can indoctrinate them into our way of seeing the world and make them the kind of people we want them to be. It's time that the church learns that lesson as well.
Okay, George Barna, you certainly move us to self-reflection and to prayer. Thank you for providing those insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary.
Well, I want to tell you something. Get this word out. We will start next week, and we're going to stay at it. And we're going to see that everyone that we have influence with is going to develop a biblical worldview. It will change your life starting next week. Amen? God bless you. Stand to your feet. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you, be gracious to you, and give you peace. Amen. God bless you.